Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The hidden photograph. What would you do if one small photograph quietly slipped out of your husband's favorite book and made you question everything you believed about your marriage? Sometimes the biggest storms do not begin with loud arguments. They begin with silence, a faded smile in an old picture, and one simple question that refuses to leave your mind. If you have ever wondered whether love can survive doubt, stay with me until the end of the story. Because what I discovered changed not only my marriage, but also the way I see trust, family, and even the simple English conversations that slowly became part of our everyday life in America. My name is Emily, and this happened to me just a few months ago in the United States. It was an ordinary Saturday morning. The sun was shining through the kitchen window, my children were laughing in the backyard, and my husband was fixing a small wooden chair that our youngest daughter had accidentally broken the night before. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked normal. At least that was what I believed before I walked into our living room with a cup of coffee and decided to organize the bookshelf that had become a little too crowded. I have always loved quiet weekends like this. They remind me that happiness is usually hidden inside ordinary moments instead of dramatic ones. While dusting the shelves, I smiled as I read the familiar book titles that my husband had collected over the years. Some were history books. Others were novels. A few were simple English reading books that we sometimes use together after dinner. Reading short stories aloud had become one of my favorite ways to improve my English naturally. We never treated it like homework. Instead, it became part of our family routine. Sometimes our children listened. Sometimes they laughed at my pronunciation, and we all laughed together. Those little moments made learning feel warm instead of stressful. I reached for an old hardcover book that looked older than the others. As I opened it, something gently slipped onto the wooden floor. At first, I thought it was just an old receipt or a bookmark. But when I picked it up, my heart suddenly became very still. It was a photograph. The edges were worn. The colors had faded with time. In the picture stood a young woman with bright eyes and a gentle smile. She looked happy, very happy, and standing beside her was my husband. They looked close, closer than strangers. They were both smiling in a way I had never seen before. I stared at the picture much longer than I wanted to admit. My mind immediately started creating stories that might not even be true. Who was she? Why had he kept this photograph? Why had I never seen it before? The strange thing was that the back of the photo contained only 3 handwritten words. Thank you. Always. No name. No date. Nothing else. Those 3 words somehow made everything even more mysterious. I wanted to laugh at myself for overthinking. After all, everyone has a past. Every old photograph tells only one frozen second of a much longer story. Psychology researchers often explain that our brains naturally fill empty spaces with imagined answers because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. In other words, the human brain would rather invent a painful explanation than patiently wait for the real one. I knew that. I had read about it before. Yet knowing something and feeling something are completely different experiences. I quietly slipped the photograph into my pocket just as my husband walked into the room carrying a toolbox. He smiled at me exactly, as he always did. Everything okay? He asked. I smiled back almost automatically. Yes, just cleaning. It was such a simple conversation. 2 ordinary sentences. But for the first time in years, I wondered if I was hearing only his words instead of his truth. The rest of the afternoon passed like a normal family day. We cooked lunch together. We watched our children ride their bicycles around the neighborhood. We even practiced a few simple English expressions together, laughing when our youngest daughter proudly corrected my pronunciation of the word photograph. The irony almost made me smile. That single word followed me everywhere. Photograph. 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 As evening arrived and the house became quiet, I took the picture out again. Under the soft light of the bedroom lamp, I noticed something I had completely missed before. Hidden in the blurry background was a small sign with a familiar name, a place my husband had mentioned only once many years ago. My heartbeat quickened. Suddenly, I realized this photograph might not be about another woman at all. Or it might reveal something far more surprising than I could possibly imagine. I had no idea that the next conversation with my husband would change our family forever. Questions without answers. Have you ever smiled at someone while your mind was quietly asking 100 questions you were too afraid to say out loud? That evening, I discovered something surprising about myself. The mysterious photograph was no longer just a piece of old paper. It had become a mirror, reflecting every hidden insecurity I thought I had already overcome. I wanted the truth, but I was also terrified that the truth might change everything. Looking back now, I realize the hardest conversations are usually the ones we first have inside our own minds. After putting the children to bed, I sat alone in the living room while the television played softly in the background. I was not really watching it. My attention kept returning to the photograph resting inside the pages of my notebook. Outside, our quiet neighborhood looked peaceful. A neighbor walked her dog beneath the streetlights. Someone across the street was watering flowers. Everything around me felt ordinary, yet inside my heart nothing felt ordinary anymore. I remembered something I had recently read while practicing English through short stories. The sentence was simple: the mind tells stories before it finds facts. I repeated it several times because it was easy to understand, but that night those words suddenly carried a much deeper meaning. My imagination had already written an entire novel before my husband had even explained a single page of the real story. I asked myself uncomfortable questions. Had he loved someone before me? Of course he probably had. Most people do. But why keep her photograph hidden for so many years? Why never mention her? And why did those handwritten words on the back, "Thank you, always," sound so personal? My thoughts moved faster than logic. That is exactly what psychologists often describe when explaining anxiety. Our brains are designed to protect us from danger, but they cannot always tell the difference between real danger and imagined danger. When information is incomplete, the brain fills empty spaces with assumptions. Unfortunately, those assumptions are often darker than reality. I knew this, yet my emotions refused to listen. My husband walked into the kitchen carrying 2 cups of hot tea. He smiled the same warm smile I had seen thousands of times before. "Long day?" he asked gently. "A little," I replied. He sat beside me without saying anything else. For several quiet minutes, we simply listened to the sound of the dishwasher humming in the background. It amazed me how silence could feel comforting one day and frightening the next. I looked at his face, searching for clues that probably did not exist. Did he seem nervous? Was he hiding something? Or was I simply looking for signs because I expected to find them? Human beings are surprisingly good at seeing patterns even when there are none. Scientists call it confirmation bias. Once we believe something might be true, our brains begin collecting tiny pieces of evidence while ignoring everything that points in the opposite direction. Suddenly, I understood that I was doing exactly that. Every ordinary expression on his face suddenly looked suspicious simply because I had already created a question without an answer. Before going upstairs, my husband said something completely unexpected. "I found an old storage box in the garage today," he said casually. "There are probably a lot of memories inside. Maybe this weekend we can look through everything together." My heart skipped a beat. Storage box. Memories. Was it connected to the photograph? I almost asked immediately, but the words refused to leave my mouth. Instead, I smiled and nodded. That sounds nice. It was strange how two people could speak honestly while still hiding completely different thoughts. The next morning, our family followed our usual routine. We made pancakes together. Our youngest daughter practiced reading a simple English sentence from her children's book. Every picture has a story. She smiled proudly after saying it correctly. My husband applauded her, and I quietly repeated the sentence in my mind. Every picture has a story. Maybe that was exactly what I needed to remember. A photograph captures only 1 second. It never explains what happened before or after. As the children left the kitchen to play outside, I finally took the mysterious picture from my notebook. This time I looked much more carefully. There was something tiny near the bottom corner that I had completely overlooked. It was almost impossible to see unless the light hit it perfectly. A small handwritten number, followed by 2 letters. At first it looked meaningless. Then I suddenly recognized it. It was not part of a date. It was not an address. It was the room number of a place my husband had mentioned only once during our marriage, a place connected to one of the most difficult periods of his life. My breathing slowed. Maybe I had been asking the wrong question all along. Maybe instead of asking, "Who is she?" I should have been asking, "What happened there?" I picked up the photograph again, determined that before another day ended, I would finally ask my husband the question that had quietly taken over my heart. But I had no idea his answer would reveal a truth far more emotional than I was prepared to hear. Everyday life together. Sometimes the greatest mystery is not hidden inside an old photograph, but inside the ordinary life we stop noticing. I almost let one faded picture erase years of laughter, trust, and quiet love. Before I finally asked my husband the question that had been echoing inside my mind, something unexpected happened over the next 24 hours. Looking back now, I believe those ordinary moments saved me from making a painful mistake that could have changed our family forever. The following morning felt brighter than the day before, but my thoughts were still cloudy. I woke up early, made coffee, and watched the sunrise through our kitchen window while the neighborhood slowly came to life. In our part of the United States, mornings always carried a peaceful rhythm. Joggers waved as they passed by. School buses stopped at familiar corners. Parents hurried their children into cars with backpacks almost bigger than they were. Life moved forward without waiting for anyone's private worries. I stood there holding my warm coffee, realizing how strange it was that the entire world looked exactly the same while my heart felt completely different. My husband came downstairs wearing his favorite blue sweatshirt and smiled the moment he saw me.
"Good morning," he said.
"You look like you're thinking about something important." I almost laughed because he was absolutely right, yet I answered with only one word. "Maybe." He kissed my forehead, poured himself coffee, and began making breakfast for the children as if nothing unusual existed between us. Watching him carefully cut strawberries into heart shapes for our youngest daughter made me hesitate. Could someone who showed this much kindness every single day truly be hiding something terrible? My thoughts immediately answered with another question. Kind people can have secrets too. That sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted. Later that morning we drove together to a local farmer's market. It had become one of our family's favorite weekend traditions. Fresh vegetables, homemade bread, flowers, local honey, musicians playing guitars near the entrance. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. The children ran toward a small stand selling homemade lemonade while my husband and I walked slowly between rows of colorful fruit. He reached for my hand naturally, exactly as he always had. His hand felt warm,
familiar,
safe. Yet somewhere deep inside me, uncertainty still whispered quietly. While we waited in line to buy fresh apples, I noticed an elderly couple standing ahead of us. They smiled constantly at each other without saying very much. When the cashier accidentally gave them too much change, they laughed together before returning it. There was something peaceful about the way they looked at one another. Not excitement. Not perfection. Simply trust earned through many ordinary years. I wondered whether every long marriage had moments like mine. Perhaps every couple eventually faced a day when imagination became louder than reality. During lunch, my son asked if we could continue our family English reading time later that evening. We had recently started reading simple short stories together because they helped everyone practice listening and speaking naturally. My husband smiled immediately. "Of course," he said. "Maybe tonight everyone can read one page." I smiled too. Those reading sessions had never been about perfect grammar. They were about spending time together. One sentence from our current story suddenly caught my attention. Truth arrives slowly, but fear runs fast. I repeated it quietly several times because I liked how simple it sounded. Then I realized it described my own situation perfectly. Fear had already traveled far ahead while truth had barely begun its journey. Psychology explains this beautifully. Researchers often describe something called emotional reasoning. Instead of saying, "I feel afraid," we accidentally conclude, "There must be something to fear." Feelings become evidence, even when no evidence actually exists. Sitting there beside my family, I recognized that my emotions were trying to write a conclusion before hearing the complete story. That realization made me breathe a little easier, but it did not erase my curiosity. In the afternoon, my husband went into the garage to continue organizing old boxes. I watched quietly through the kitchen window as he carried several dusty containers onto the driveway. One box looked particularly old. It was sealed with faded brown tape that seemed untouched for years. My heart immediately remembered the storage box he had mentioned the night before. Was that the one? I considered walking outside several times, but something stopped me. If I truly wanted honesty, perhaps I needed to begin by trusting enough to ask instead of secretly searching. The children called me outside to help them plant flowers near the front porch. We laughed as dirt covered our hands and shoes. For almost an hour, I forgot completely about the photograph. Then, everything changed. My husband suddenly called my name from inside the garage. His voice sounded calm, but different. I walked toward him, brushing soil from my jeans. He was standing beside the old storage box with its lid finally open. In his hands was a small envelope that looked even older than the mysterious photograph. He looked at me quietly for several seconds before speaking. "Emily," he said softly, "I think it's finally time for you to know everything." Then he slowly turned the envelope over. And written across the front in faded blue ink were the exact same 3 words I had seen on the back of the photograph. "Thank you, always." Looking for the truth. What if the answer you fear the most turns out to be completely different from the story your mind has been writing? Standing in our garage that quiet afternoon, I realized something powerful. Sometimes we do not suffer because of the truth. We suffer because we give our imagination too much time before asking a simple question. I believed I was about to uncover a secret love, but within the next few minutes, every assumption I had carefully built began to fall apart one by one. The old storage box rested between us, covered with years of dust, while the afternoon sunlight streamed through the garage window. My husband held the faded envelope gently, almost as if it contained something fragile beyond paper. He looked at me with calm eyes and said, "Emily, before I tell you everything, I only ask one thing. Please let me finish before you decide what this story means." His voice was steady, not defensive. That alone surprised me. I nodded quietly. "I promise." He smiled with relief and placed the mysterious photograph beside the envelope. "I know you found this picture," he said softly. My heart skipped a beat. I had never admitted it. "How did you know?" I asked. He laughed gently. "Because I noticed it was missing from my old book yesterday morning. I thought you deserved an explanation, but I also wanted you to ask when you were ready." His answer immediately made me feel both embarrassed and grateful. During the last 2 days, I had imagined hidden lies while he had simply been waiting patiently for an honest conversation. It reminded me of a simple English sentence I often practice with our children. Don't guess.
Ask.
Only 3 short words, but suddenly they felt wiser than ever. My husband slowly opened the envelope. Inside were several carefully folded papers and another old photograph. This picture looked very different. The same young woman stood beside a group of volunteers outside a community building. My husband was there too, smiling with everyone else, but they were standing several feet apart. Nothing about the picture suggested romance. Instead, it felt like a memory shared by people who had gone through something meaningful together. "Who is she?" I finally whispered. He looked down for a long moment before answering. "Her name was Grace." I noticed the word immediately. He did not say is. He said was. My breathing slowed. There was sadness in his voice, but not the sadness of lost love. It was something quieter, something deeper. "Grace changed my life," he continued, "but not in the way you're probably imagining." He carefully unfolded one of the yellowed papers and handed it to me. It was a handwritten letter. Time had faded most of the ink, but the first sentence remained perfectly clear. "If you are reading this, it means I am probably gone." I felt chills run through my arms. My husband watched my reaction before speaking again. "Emily, I never kept that photograph because I wanted to remember a relationship. I kept it because I never wanted to forget kindness." My mind became completely still. Every fear I had carried suddenly collided with a truth I had never expected. Psychology teaches that gratitude creates stronger and longer-lasting memories than many ordinary life events. Maybe that was why he had protected this envelope for so many years. But one question still remained. If Grace was not someone he loved romantically, why had he never told me about her? It seemed impossible that such an important person had never appeared in any conversation during our marriage. Almost as if he had heard my thoughts, my husband took a slow breath and looked directly into my eyes. "There's one part of the story," he said quietly, "that I've never told anyone, not even you." My heart began racing again. I realized the photograph had never been the real mystery. The real mystery had always been the untold story hidden behind it, and I was finally about to hear it. A story from long ago. Some stories stay hidden for years not because people want to deceive us, but because the memories still hurt every time they are spoken aloud. As I stood silently beside my husband in the garage, I realized I was no longer searching for another woman. I was about to discover another version of the man I had loved for years, a version he had quietly carried inside his heart without ever asking anyone to understand it. He looked down at the old letter before speaking again. "Emily," he said softly, "this happened many years ago, but every detail still feels close." He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "There was a time when I believed my future had completely fallen apart. I had never heard him say anything like that before. My husband was usually the calmest person in our family. He solved problems without complaining. He encouraged our children whenever they felt discouraged. It was difficult to imagine him feeling completely hopeless." He continued, "I volunteered at a community support center every weekend because I wanted to stay busy. I wasn't looking for answers. I was simply trying to keep moving." That was where he met Grace. She was one of the volunteer coordinators, always greeting everyone with the same warm smile. According to him, she remembered every person's name, noticed when someone looked exhausted, and somehow knew exactly what to say without making people feel embarrassed. She treated everyone as if they mattered, he said, even strangers. One afternoon, after a long day of volunteering, Grace noticed that he had been unusually quiet. She sat beside him outside the building and handed him a cup of coffee. She did not ask difficult questions. Instead, she said something incredibly simple. "You don't have to pretend you're okay today." Those words stayed with him forever. Sometimes healing begins not with advice, but with permission to be honest. Listening to him, I remembered another easy English sentence our family often practiced together. Kindness costs nothing. It sounded like a sentence from a children's book, yet its meaning suddenly felt much deeper. My husband smiled gently while remembering her. Grace never tried to solve my problems. She simply reminded me that difficult seasons don't last forever. Over the following months, the volunteers worked together on food drives, neighborhood cleanups, and family events. They celebrated birthdays, laughed over simple meals, and supported people they had never met before. Grace inspired everyone around her, not because she was perfect, but because she believed small acts of kindness could quietly change lives. Then his voice became softer. One day she stopped coming. My heart tightened. He explained that Grace had become seriously ill. The volunteers visited her whenever they could. Even from her hospital room, she continued writing encouraging notes to other people instead of talking about herself. My husband reached into the envelope and showed me one final card written in her handwriting. Across the front, she had written only 4 words. Keep helping.
Keep smiling.
I could hardly hold back my tears. Suddenly, the mysterious photograph looked completely different.
It was not a secret of romance.
It was a memory of gratitude. Yet one question still remained unanswered. If Grace had meant so much to him, why had he hidden every trace of her for so many years instead of sharing the story with me? My husband looked toward the house, where our children were laughing through the open kitchen window. Then he whispered something I never expected to hear. Emily, there is one promise I made to Grace before she died, and until today, I have never told anyone what that promise was. Learning to trust again. What if the greatest love story is not about finding the perfect person, but about learning to trust the person already standing beside you? At that moment, I understood something that completely surprised me. The mysterious photograph had brought me to the edge of fear, yet the real lesson waiting for me was not about another woman. It was about whether I would choose suspicion or understanding when life placed an unanswered question in front of me. My husband held the final handwritten card carefully, as though he were protecting a small piece of someone else's kindness. He looked at me with quiet eyes and finally answered the question that had been lingering between us. Before Grace passed away, she asked me to promise her something. He paused, taking a slow breath. She said, "If someone truly loves you one day, don't let your painful memories stop you from loving them completely." I felt my eyes fill with tears almost immediately. That was not the promise I had expected. I had imagined secrets, regrets, or unfinished romance. Instead, her final wish had nothing to do with keeping him tied to the past. It was about helping him build a better future. My husband smiled gently. For a long time, I kept these letters because I was afraid that talking about Grace would make people misunderstand our friendship. I didn't want anyone to think she was someone standing between my future family and me. I reached for his hand without thinking. "I wish you had trusted me enough to tell me sooner," I whispered. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I should have." That simple admission meant more than a perfect excuse ever could. Researchers who study healthy marriages often explain that trust does not grow because couples never make mistakes. Trust grows because both people are willing to tell the truth, accept responsibility, and keep choosing honesty even when it feels uncomfortable. Standing there in the garage, I realized we were doing exactly that. We were not protecting our pride. We were protecting our relationship. Later that evening, after dinner, our family gathered in the living room for our usual English reading time. The children each took turns reading a few simple sentences from a short storybook. When it was my turn, I read one sentence aloud that immediately touched my heart. Trust grows one conversation at a time. I smiled because the words perfectly described everything I had learned over the last few days. Our daughter asked me what trust meant. I looked at my husband before answering. It means believing someone even when fear tries to speak louder. She smiled innocently, repeated the sentence in English, and everyone applauded her. Sometimes children understand life's greatest lessons more naturally than adults do. As the evening grew quieter, my husband carried the old envelope back toward the garage. This time, however, he stopped halfway. He turned around and walked back to me. "Emily," he said softly, "I don't think these memories belong hidden inside a dusty box anymore." He placed the photograph and the letters gently into my hands. "I'd like you to decide what we should do with them." I looked down at the faded picture that had once filled me with fear. Now it felt completely different. It no longer represented doubt. It represented gratitude, kindness, and the quiet courage to keep loving after difficult seasons. Yet as I carefully gathered the papers together, something unexpected slipped from inside the envelope and landed silently on the floor. It was a tiny folded note that neither of us had ever seen before. My husband frowned in surprise. "I've never noticed that before," he whispered. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the small piece of paper, and the first line made both of us fall completely silent. Family over fear. What if the smallest piece of paper hidden inside an old envelope carried the message that both of us needed to hear most? When that tiny folded note slipped onto our garage floor, neither my husband nor I moved for a few seconds. It felt impossible that after all these years there could still be one more surprise waiting inside a story we thought we finally understood. I slowly unfolded the delicate note, careful not to tear the aging paper. The handwriting matched Grace's elegant script. The ink had faded, but every word remained readable. The first sentence simply said, "If this note is found, it means life has continued exactly as I hoped." I looked at my husband, who seemed just as surprised as I was. "I've honestly never seen this before," he whispered. We continued reading together. Grace wrote that she had hidden the note because she believed people often reopened old memories only when they were finally ready to understand them. She thanked everyone who had shared kindness during her difficult days, and then wrote something that immediately touched my heart. "Please don't let gratitude become sadness. Turn it into love for the people still beside you." Those words filled the quiet garage with a peaceful silence. I suddenly realized how much time I had wasted allowing fear to speak louder than love. My husband gently squeezed my hand. Neither of us needed many words anymore. Some truths arrive so clearly that explanations become unnecessary. Our youngest proudly practiced another simple English sentence she had learned. "Today is a beautiful day." We all repeated it together, smiling after each word. I loved moments like that because learning English had never been about memorizing difficult grammar. It had become a way for our family to slow down, laugh together, and appreciate ordinary conversations. As we cleaned the kitchen, I kept thinking about Grace's note. Positive psychology often explains that gratitude changes the way our brains remember difficult experiences. Instead of focusing only on pain, gratitude helps us notice the kindness that existed alongside it. Perhaps that was exactly why my husband had protected those memories for so many years. They reminded him not of loss, but of hope. Later that afternoon, we took the children to a nearby community park. Families filled the walking trails, children chased bubbles across the grass, and musicians played cheerful songs near the lake. Watching my husband push our youngest daughter on the swing made me smile in a completely different way than before. 2 days earlier, I had looked at him searching for hidden secrets. Now I found myself noticing something much more important: his everyday kindness. Sometimes, love does not reveal itself through grand romantic gestures. Sometimes it quietly appears in packed school lunches, patient bedtime stories, and warm jackets placed over little shoulders when the evening becomes cool. As the sun began to set, my son suddenly asked an innocent question. "Mom, what's the best picture we've ever taken as a family?" Everyone started laughing while trying to choose different vacations and birthdays. I quietly looked at my husband before answering. "I don't think it's happened yet." The children looked confused. I smiled and explained, "The best family picture is always the next one, because we're still making beautiful memories together." My husband smiled at me with eyes full of understanding. He knew that answer was about much more than photographs. On the drive home, the old envelope rested peacefully in the glove compartment. For the first time, I no longer felt afraid of it. But just as we turned into our neighborhood, my husband's phone rang through the car speakers. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was a number neither of us recognized. After a brief hesitation, he answered. A calm voice spoke only one sentence before the line went silent. "I believe I have something that once belonged to Grace, and I think your family should see it." The real meaning of love. What if one unexpected phone call could rewrite the ending of a story you thought was already complete? As we drove home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, neither my husband nor I said very much. The stranger's voice had been calm, almost gentle, yet those few words echoed in my mind again and again. Someone had something that belonged to Grace, and somehow they believed our family should have it. I could not stop wondering what it might be, or why it had appeared after so many years. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, my husband returned the phone call. The stranger introduced herself as Sarah, the current director of the Community Support Center where Grace had volunteered for many years. She explained that the organization had recently been renovating an old storage room when they discovered several carefully labeled memory boxes that had never been opened. One of them carried Grace's name. Inside were photographs, thank you cards, volunteer records, and a small package with my husband's full name written across the front. Sarah apologized for contacting us so late, but said she felt the package belonged with our family. We arranged to meet the following afternoon at the community center. The next day, I walked into the familiar brick building from the old photographs for the very first time. It looked warm and welcoming, filled with volunteers preparing food, organizing donated clothing, and greeting visitors with genuine smiles. The atmosphere immediately helped me understand why my husband had spoken about Grace with so much respect. Kindness truly seemed to live inside those walls. Sarah welcomed us warmly and placed a small wooden box on the table between us. Grace always believed that encouragement should outlive the person giving it, she said with a smile. She left little reminders for many people. My husband carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay several old volunteer badges, a group photograph we had never seen before, and one sealed envelope. Written neatly across the front were 5 simple words: "Open when you find peace." My husband looked at me before opening it, as if silently asking whether I was ready to continue this journey with him. I nodded. Together, we unfolded the letter. Grace wrote that life had taught her one beautiful lesson. Love is not measured by how tightly we hold onto the past, but by how generously we care for the people standing beside us today. She thanked my husband for never giving up on kindness, even during difficult seasons, and encouraged him to build a joyful family without carrying unnecessary guilt. Reading those words, I suddenly realized that Grace had never been competing with our marriage. In a quiet way, she had been protecting it long before it even existed. I felt tears forming, not because I was sad, but because every fear I had carried now seemed so small compared to the generosity of someone I had never even met. On the drive home, our daughter asked if we could practice another English sentence together. I smiled through my tears and said, "Love grows when we share it." She repeated the sentence perfectly, then asked what it meant. My husband answered before I could. "It means the more kindness you give away, the more love you bring home." That simple explanation filled the car with peaceful silence. Research in positive psychology often shows that acts of gratitude strengthen relationships more than expensive gifts or dramatic promises. I understood that completely now. The mysterious photograph had never been about another woman stealing my husband's heart. It had always been about one extraordinary person teaching him how to love life more deeply. As we pulled into our driveway, I thought the mystery had finally reached its beautiful ending. Then my husband quietly reached into the wooden box one last time and noticed something hidden beneath the velvet lining. It was a tiny silver key attached to a faded tag with only one handwritten sentence. "The final gift is waiting where we first met." A new chapter begins. What would you feel if someone you had never met somehow understood your heart before you even knew your own story? The small card resting on our living room floor carried my name, yet Grace had written it years before I ever became part of my husband's life. My hands trembled as I picked it up. In that quiet moment, I realized this was no longer a mystery about the past. It had become a message about the future my family was still creating together. I carefully unfolded the card while everyone around me remained silent. Grace's handwriting was as gentle as before. The first sentence immediately brought tears to my eyes. "Dear Emily, if life has brought you here, then someone very special has chosen to love the man I believed would one day smile again." I looked at my husband in complete surprise. He had never seen the letter before either. Grace continued writing as though she were speaking directly to me across time. She thanked me for giving him a family, a home filled with laughter, and a reason to keep believing in ordinary happiness. Of course, she could never have known my name when she wrote the letter. Later, Sarah explained that Grace had intentionally left a blank space where the future spouse's name could be added if the card was ever discovered. Someone at the community center had carefully written Emily after learning about our family years later, following Grace's instructions. Somehow that thoughtful detail made the letter feel even more personal. The message continued, "Please don't compare yourself to anyone from the past. Every season of life has a different purpose. Mine was to encourage him to keep walking. Yours is to walk beside him." I could hardly continue reading through my tears. Those words quietly dissolved every remaining trace of insecurity inside me. My husband wrapped his arm around my shoulders, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence carries more healing than the longest conversation. Over the following weeks, something beautiful began to change inside our family. Instead of placing the scrapbook back into storage, we decided to add our own pages. The children drew colorful pictures about kindness. My husband wrote about the importance of gratitude. I wrote about the lesson I had learned from one mysterious photograph. We even included simple English sentences beneath each page so our children could practice reading together. One of our favorites became, "Choose understanding before fear." It was easy enough for everyone to remember, yet powerful enough to guide us whenever misunderstandings appeared. Family psychologists often explain that strong relationships are built through shared stories. The experiences couples remember together become part of the emotional foundation that carries them through future challenges. Looking back now, I understand why. The photograph was no longer just an object. It had become part of our family story, teaching all of us that trust grows strongest when honesty meets compassion. A month later, our family returned to the community center, not because we had more questions, but because we wanted to volunteer together. Watching our children help organize donated books filled me with quiet joy. The same place that had once held unanswered mysteries was now creating new memories. Before leaving, Sarah handed me a framed copy of Grace's favorite quote. It simply read, "The best way to honor yesterday is to love today well." I knew exactly where it would hang in our home. That evening, after dinner, we gathered once again for our English reading time. My daughter smiled proudly and read aloud, "Kindness never ends." Everyone applauded. I looked around the room and realized that Grace's kindness truly had not ended. It was alive in our family now. Just as I believed every chapter of the story had finally reached its peaceful conclusion, my husband quietly reached into his pocket and smiled. "Emily," he said, "there's one last surprise I've been saving. Not from the past, but for our future together." The photo stays, love grows. What if the happiest ending is not discovering the truth about yesterday, but making a promise about tomorrow? When my husband smiled and said he had one final surprise waiting for me, I thought another hidden letter or forgotten photograph might appear. Instead, what happened that evening became the most meaningful memory our family had ever created together, proving that real love is not built by perfect people. It is built by ordinary people who choose trust, kindness, and honesty every single day. My husband reached into his jacket pocket and carefully placed a small folded piece of paper in my hands. I opened it slowly. It was not an old letter. It was a simple family promise that he had written only a few days earlier. Across the top, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Our family promise." Beneath the title, he had written 5 short sentences. "We will ask before we assume. We will listen before we judge. We will forgive before anger grows. We will keep learning together. We will choose love every day." I looked at him with tears in my eyes. After everything we had experienced, those simple promises felt more valuable than anything money could ever buy. Without saying a word, our children came closer and asked if they could sign the paper too. One by one, each of us added our names. That small sheet of paper became one of the most precious things in our home. The following weekend, we returned to the community center carrying the scrapbook Grace had inspired us to continue. Our children added new drawings. My husband wrote about gratitude. I wrote about the lesson hidden inside one faded photograph. At the bottom of my page, I included an easy English sentence that had become my favorite. Love begins with trust. It was simple enough for beginners learning English, but powerful enough to guide an entire family. Before leaving, we donated several beginner English storybooks to the children's reading room. I smiled as I imagined another family sitting together, reading slowly, laughing over pronunciation, and creating memories just as we had. Learning English had quietly become much more than vocabulary for us. It had become a reason to spend time together, to listen carefully, and to appreciate the beauty of simple conversations. Researchers often explain that families who regularly share meaningful conversations build stronger emotional resilience. Looking back, I believe our nightly reading sessions had prepared us for this moment without us even realizing it. They taught us patience, listening, and empathy, qualities that mattered far beyond language learning. A few weeks later, I framed the mysterious photograph that had started everything. Friends who visited our home sometimes asked, "Who's the woman in the picture?" I always smiled before answering. She was someone who taught our family that kindness never truly disappears. Every time I looked at that photograph, I no longer saw fear. I saw gratitude. I saw second chances. I saw the invisible thread connecting one person's compassion to another family's happiness years later. My husband often jokes that the photograph has become the most famous picture in our house. Maybe he's right. But to me, it represents something much bigger than a single moment frozen in time. It reminds me that the stories we invent are rarely as beautiful as the truth we patiently discover. If there is one lesson I hope you carry with you after listening to my story, it is this. Never allow unanswered questions to become permanent conclusions.
Ask.
Listen.
Trust.
Love grows strongest where honesty lives. And sometimes, the greatest gift another person leaves behind is not a photograph or a letter. It is the kindness that quietly continues through people they may never even meet. Today, our family still gathers in the living room several evenings each week to read simple English stories together. We still laugh at funny pronunciation mistakes. We still learn one new sentence at a time. And every now and then, I glance at that framed photograph on the bookshelf and whisper, "Thank you, always." This story began with fear, but it ended with hope. It began with a mystery, but it became a reminder that trust is the strongest foundation any family can build. Perhaps that is why I no longer wonder who the woman in the photograph was. I simply feel grateful that her kindness helped shape the love my family enjoys today.